The Rhodesian War has gone down in history all wrong. The struggle has been painted as a small group of racist white settlers who were still stuck in colonial times, refusing to let go of power. They, for no reason other than blind racism, decided to not let blacks partake in the governing of their country, and they attempted to defend their apartheid regime by force. The whites in this narrative, of course, horribly mistreated the blacks, almost to the point of slavery. This is all total nonsense. The Rhodesian cause was perhaps the most justified cause that has ever been fought for. History has proven this to be completely and utterly the case. European settlers had turned a barbarous land with no written language or even the wheel into a prosperous outpost of civilization in merely a few decades. This is what they were defending. To begin with, it is worth looking at the state of Rhodesia before her independence and before the war began. After World War II, the Rhodesians, who had recently refused an offer of independence from Great Britain, were left with a choice. They could join a union with South Africa or form a federation with North Rhodesia, modern-day Zambia, and Nyasaland, modern-day Malawi. The British strongly suggested that the latter option should be taken, and the Rhodesians were nudged in that direction. The people chose the federation narrowly, but this project lasted merely 10 years. The British went back on their promises and allowed Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland to obtain their independence. The Southern Rhodesians were denied theirs. At the Dissolution Conference, the British Deputy Prime Minister, Rab Butler, told Rhodesian Prime Minister Winston Field, quote, "I am in the pleasant position to be able to tell you that Her Majesty's government has given the deepest consideration to your request that Southern Rhodesia will get independence no later than the other two territories. In view of your country's wonderful record of responsible government over the past 40 years, during which time you have conducted yourself without blemish, managed your financial affairs in an exemplary fashion, and above all, the great loyalty you have always given to Britain in time of war, not only in the two world wars, but subsequently in Africa and with your air force in Aden, I have been asked to convey to you our government's long-standing gratitude for your exemplary record, and to confirm that in these circumstances we are able and willing to meet your request." End quote. This promise was betrayed. But regardless, Southern Rhodesia was seen as the jewel of Africa, a model colony, indeed a self-governing colony. The British had never run the place directly, a dominion in all but name. The high standards in Rhodesia did not just apply to whites, but to the blacks too. With the exception of South Africa, Rhodesia could boast, by far, the highest living standards for blacks on the continent. Indeed, around 1/3 of Rhodesian blacks were immigrants from neighbouring countries who had come due to just how good things were. Rhodesian Prime Minister from 1964 to 1979, Ian Smith, writes in his memoirs, The Great Betrayal, quote, "British representatives on the committee had pointed out that the evidence showed very clearly how much more we had done for our black people in the fields of health, education, housing, culture, and recreation facilities than Britain had achieved in the two northern territories. There was an obvious reason. To our north, the countries were British colonies governed by British civil servants who went back home after 18 months' service, their children being educated in Britain. Here, in Rhodesia, we knew that the country was ours in perpetuity, and our children and grandchildren would go on living here. Hence the need for us to work in conjunction with our indigenous people and incorporate them into our plans for the future. It was for this reason that it was well known that we had the best race relations and the highest standard of living for our people than any country in Africa." End quote. The British clearly felt that Southern Rhodesia was far more advanced than her almost entirely black counterpart in Northern Rhodesia, or indeed anywhere else in Africa. Northern Rhodesia was to be given independence. The former was to be betrayed. The British simply turned around and said that Southern Rhodesia must be governed by her majority population, the Africans. African-led countries in Africa was certainly nothing new. Indeed, that experiment had been underway in the decade leading up to the Federation's dissolution in 1963. This experiment went how every European who actually lived amongst Africans predicted. Without fail, every African nation that was given its independence duly collapsed into anarchy or dictatorship within years, if not months. It was hard to find a democracy which had ever had more than one election in Africa. Indeed, as Elspeth Huxley once said, you cannot translate leader of the opposition into any African language. The closest result is chief enemy. Democracy was a foreign concept. The African only knew dictatorship and the brutal treatment of your political opponents. Whites, not a majority in any nation in Africa, always ended up facing disaster when the blacks took charge. The Congo was, of course, the most famous example. From the second the Congolese were given their independence, they turned to killing each other and their white population. Not just killing, either, but killing in the most barbaric ways. Nuns, especially, were singled out for horrific treatment. This butchery saw an absolute flood of whites entering southern Rhodesia from the Congo, with many a horror story to tell. All of the civilization which Europeans had built up over decades, or even centuries, had collapsed immediately. As Stephen Mitford Goodson put it, quote, "In 1960, sub-Saharan Africa was one of the most prosperous parts of the world, a net exporter of food, with not one of its colonies burdened by international debt. This pleasant state of affairs would change dramatically over the ensuing years for the worse." End quote. To anyone with eyes, the African experiment had failed. Clearly, the Europeans had pulled out too early. To the British, however, this meant nothing. The demands for southern Rhodesia to hand over control to her blacks only increased. Rhodesia, frankly, was being asked to commit suicide. And this, obviously, they could not do. The Rhodesians were ready to concede almost everything, but suicide was beyond the pale. Ian Smith was not the racialist or the far-right winger which Harold Wilson and the British in general made him out to be. A.K. Chesterton, perhaps rightly, labelled him as a man of the centre. The actual far-right Rhodesians were constantly in Smith's ear telling him that he was giving too much ground. They were quite right, although whether he had a choice or not was another matter. Smith and most Rhodesians reluctantly conceded that majority rule would have to become a fact. The only point they were debating was when and how. Handing over control now would just result in another Congo. Only a lunatic would wish to put their people in such a situation. Give us time, Smith reasoned, and somehow we will make civilized democrats out of our Africans. Slowly but surely, the blacks would have to be introduced to parliamentary democracy, and, as and when they were ready for it and met the qualifications, more and more Africans would be able to vote. Then, in Smith's mind, Rhodesia could be a functioning, multiracial democracy. Rhodesia had always had multiracial voting, and, in fact, she had even conceded and created black-only seats. Blacks, like whites, had always had to meet a certain income or property criteria in order to vote. The problem was, though, that most Africans simply didn't want to know. After independence, most Africans stood with Smith. The vast majority of them lived in the tribal trust lands, just as their ancestors had. They simply lived in their villages and let the chiefs take charge. The chiefs, again, were almost all pro-Smith and anti-terrorist. This was the kind of living which Rhodesia's Africans preferred. They didn't want democracy. They didn't even understand it. It was a foreign concept. The white man offered him the world, but he simply didn't want to know. All kinds of excellent schooling and medical facilities were offered, but most Africans just wanted to live as they always had. This, of course, was their right. The British settlers, as rulers, had allowed them to live their lives without being slaughtered by neighbouring tribes. They saw no reason to give up that peaceful life. Those calling for majority rule were a tiny minority of extremists. When British Prime Minister Harold Wilson came to Rhodesia to negotiate, he met with the nationalists and was in for a rude awakening. They had no interest in the white man's games or a negotiated settlement. They wanted majority rule with no strings attached, and they wanted it now. Most of all, they wanted blood, and they explicitly refused to go the legal route. It was not a matter of black versus white, at least not yet. The Rhodesian government was simply dealing with terrorists. The victims of this terrorism were their fellow Africans almost every single time. For 15 long years, the innocent Africans, just trying to go about their usual tribal lives, were harassed into supporting the terrorists. If they refused, their families, or even their entire village, could be killed like they were nothing. This was what African rule was all about. Smith had quite the task on his hands if he wanted to raise up his African population. He wrote of the small percentage which the government actually managed to get into education. Quote, "When one is confronted with accusations that large numbers of our indigenous people did not receive adequate education, the true reasons for this are never disclosed. The fact that when the pioneers arrived in the country, as recently as 100 years ago, there was no written language and no schools. The process of bringing our black people into the education system was long and tedious. For the first half-century, they were reluctant participants. As has already been mentioned, at the breakup of the Federation in 1963, our black people enjoyed the best educational facilities on the African continent. The tremendous impetus to education by the present government since 1980 was made possible because of the foundation and infrastructure they inherited. Moreover, let us not overlook the aggravating factor that after the Pretoria Agreement of 1976, the terrorists initiated a new campaign of destroying schools in the tribal areas. Educational institutions, used exclusively for our indigenous tribespeople, books, desks, tables, chairs, and all equipment were piled in the center of the classroom and set alight. Everything associated with the white man and his civilization had to be eliminated. Hundreds of schools were burnt to the ground. I met the headmaster of one such school, who informed me that when he pleaded with the terrorists that they were destroying an asset which was being used for the welfare of their children, the reply was the butt of a rifle on the side of his head. He pointed to an ugly scar. Many thousands of our children were thus denied the opportunity of education they had previously enjoyed, hardly the fault of the previous white racists." End quote. There simply was not a sensible black movement ready to take the reins. Instead of waiting and, as Smith suggested, letting the process take place gradually, the British forced the Rhodesians to deal with communist terrorists who wanted them all dead. So much for the Cold War. Regardless, if one believed that African incompetence was due to education and that they simply just needed to be helped up over time, then Smith's approach quite rightly sounded attractive. The current argument was simply an emotional one. Pure logic dictated that the whites must continue to run the government until such a time that the blacks were ready, no matter how long that was. Smith's ideas of eventual majority rule and pure meritocracy are of course nonsense, as non-Europeans, as shown in the West today, always vote along tribal lines, not merit lines. This is quite normal. We are the anomaly, not them. European liberalism is an exclusively European affair. The rest of the world, no matter what we do, will never be convinced to kneecap themselves in the name of fairness. Is it competence or fairness which matters at the end of the day? By liberal logic, the majority should rule. This logic, however, leads to chaos. The Rhodesians chose logical competence over the emotional, moral approach of the rest of the world, which failed every single time. Trying to find a solution with the British to this conundrum was an impossible task. The British, or at least the Conservatives, were highly sympathetic. This was the post-1945 world, and they couldn't just come out and say that the white man should rule indefinitely. After all that black propaganda of World War II, that might sound just a bit too much like Hitler. The idea that blacks could be taught to partake in civilization properly, as Europeans had for centuries now, was far more acceptable. Every time this was packaged up, however, it just sounded like convoluted nonsense. Every plan involved a complicated procedure of blacks slowly gaining more black-only seats over time. A sort of House of Lords type system in which blacks could veto white laws before majority rule, promises of funding to help civilize the Africans, and much more. The requirements for Africans to gain the vote were equally complex. As noted, Rhodesia was currently a meritocracy. The blacks just simply weren't reaching up to the mark, despite having plenty of opportunities to do so. This, then, required a sort of affirmative action to make sure that unsuitable blacks could vote, but not their unsuitable white counterparts. Each and every time the British and Rhodesians came to an agreement, it fell through. More than anything, because even the harshest of British measures was shouted down by the horde of newly independent Afro-Asian Commonwealth nations, which threatened to walk out of the organization unless Rhodesia were mercilessly crushed. Prime Minister Tafawa Balewa of Nigeria was one of the loudest anti-Rhodesian voices, who was constantly crying out for British military intervention. After berating British PM Harold Wilson on one occasion, Balewa headed home, only to be brutally murdered alongside his family and allies merely days later. His nation then descended into anarchy. The Africans were all screeching about Rhodesia being a threat to world peace, despite their own countries now being completely dysfunctional on their own watch. Even whilst being entirely dependent on British aid, the dictators continued to cry that the British weren't doing enough about Rhodesia and were threatening to sever ties with London. The Rhodesians, frankly, were living in a clown world in which there was simply no solution to their problems. The economy boomed after independence, despite almost the entire world placing sanctions on the Rhodesians' landlocked nation. With their minuscule security forces, they were able to protect their gigantic borders against a terrorist horde, which, by now, was proven beyond doubt to be funded by the British. Every engagement throughout the war resulted in Rhodesian victory. Nothing they could ever do was ever good enough. Concession after concession was made to their blacks. Almost everything had been given away, or offered away and rejected. Even the South African government began to join in, and they, eventually, were the ones who threw Rhodesia under the bus, in the naive hope that they wouldn't be next on the chopping block. The emotional screeching from white liberals and the newly independent failed Afro-Asian states alike was simply too much to bear. The entire world, to varying degrees, found themselves locked in an emotional struggle to crush the Rhodesians, simply for existing. Their only true friends, except for the South African people, not their government, had been Salazar's Portugal before the coup which saw the Portuguese pull out of Mozambique. The Rhodesians were not Nazis. In fact, they had given the largest proportional contribution to Britain's war effort against Hitler. They were not racialists, as Harold Wilson described them. Most of the army was black. The Rhodesians had offered the Africans the world, when, frankly, they did not deserve it. Even whilst the terrorists slaughtered white farmers or shot down civilian airliners, they were still being offered deal after deal, which was always entirely in their benefit. All the whites refused to do was commit suicide. All they wanted was a little time, a little prudence, some measures which would mean that their handover would not result in their genocide. This wasn't good enough for the world, and eventually it was too much to bear. The Rhodesians had easily won every single battle, but they had lost the war. The world, not the terrorists, had crushed them. In 1980, an entirely unsatisfactory deal was signed, in which the British once again betrayed the Rhodesians. Over and over again, they insisted that Robert Mugabe would not come to power. They promised the Rhodesians they would ensure the election that they would preside over was free and fair. As it turned out, it was not. British bobbies stood by all over Rhodesia as Mugabe terrorized his own people into voting for him. The Rhodesians were left to deal with it. By the year 2000, the white population had gone from nearly 300,000 to merely 50,000. Most had emigrated to escape the grisly fate that was meted out to those who remained. The Africans, as they had in every other independent African nation, began to engage in genocide between the tribes as well. Majority rule had benefited no one. Unemployment under white rule was under 10%. By the 2000s, it was at 95%. Inflation reached 231 million%. People were literally starving to death in the streets. White farms were stolen by the state and given to blacks who, in almost every case, had no idea what they were doing. The soil was destroyed and rendered useless by the Africans' incompetence in the farming department. The breadbasket of Africa was now undergoing a famine. Today, one can find Zimbabwe's blacks complaining on social media that life was better for their fathers under Smith's regime. Anyone with eyes, however, could have seen this coming a mile away. The emotional mass of people, white and black alike the world over, needed to stop and think. Perhaps their high and mighty ideas weren't so high and mighty after all. The situation is much the same today. The media, and, indeed, most people until recently, insisted that immigration was a good thing. It was our duty to open up our borders to millions of third worlders. Terrorist attacks, mass rape, skyrocketing crime, and the economy being in the gutter did not change government minds. The Great Replacement simply had to keep going on. Once more, however, anyone with eyes can tell that such an experiment is going to end in tears. There will be many who, like Smith, are able to write in their memoirs and proudly proclaim, "I told you so." The story of Rhodesia is so important to us today because it shows so clearly how corrupted our politics are by emotional nonsense. The Rhodesians alone had built Rhodesia. They were the ones who, forevermore, should have ruled it. The overwhelming majority of Africans didn't even want to rule it anyway. Life was better under the British settlers. This was the simple, harsh reality. Such an opinion then would have been completely unpalatable though. Rhodesia is now dead and buried. The Rhodesians, although few in number in Zimbabwe itself, still live on, but the majority of them are scattered around the world. What they had can never be brought back except by extremely drastic action, which is not happening anytime soon. It is not, however, too late for ourselves. We still have the chance to break our chains, stop the madness, and turn the tide. We are the last frontier of civilization. Rhodesia fell, South Africa fell, but Europe and the Anglosphere does not have to. We can say no. The relevance of the Rhodesian story is why I've spent the past 9 months working on a complete history of Rhodesia. I'm not finished yet, and as I type this, I'm currently sat on almost page 200 of the Word document. Perhaps a 12-hour video. But I feel it is a topic that deserves it. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this very short video. To most, this will be their first introduction to Rhodesia, and they'll probably have no clue, in detail at least, of what I've just been saying. As noted though, I'll be covering everything in greater detail and in an understandable way in a few months' time when I'm finished with the main video. An extra special thank you to those of you who support me on Subscribestar or as YouTube members. Ever since my Patreon was randomly banned, you guys have been a lifesaver and have really dug me out of that hole and allowed me to keep producing these videos for a living. I cannot thank you enough. For those of you who are not already signed up, please do consider doing so in one of the links in the description. Even the lowest tier helps immensely. Thank you.